It's Weekend Edition from KQED News. I'm Azul Dahlstrom-Ekman, and you're listening to KQED's Reparations Radio Special.
And I'm Annalise Finney. 2 years ago, California appointed a task force to design a plan for reparations for Black Californians. Their mission was to explore how the state could repair the harms caused by discriminatory policies.
Things like redlining, over-policing, and urban planning that disproportionately put things like highways or toxic industries in Black communities.
The task force is now wrapping up its work and will submit a reparations proposal to the legislature at the end of the month.
At the same time, Juneteenth events commemorating the end of slavery are taking place today throughout the Bay Area.
In honor of the holiday, we're bringing you this radio special, exploring one way California is reckoning with the legacy of racism that slavery left behind. Stay with us, and you'll hear stories and interviews that explain the case being made for reparations in California.
Recently, I sat down with Lisa Holder, a civil rights attorney and member of the Reparations Task Force, to talk about what's contained in the final report. Ms. Holder, thanks for joining us.
It's a pleasure.
So, your work as an attorney focuses on issues like police misconduct and workplace discrimination. Can you tell me, how has this experience informed your work on the task force?
Yeah, I have been a civil rights attorney for over 20 years, and prior to that, I was a young civil rights activist working with public defenders' offices. And so all the work that I have done over the past 20 years really culminates in the work that we are doing around reparations, because reparations is basically the overarching paradigm that connects the dots.
So the task force has been meeting for 2 years now, including public listening sessions. Can you share some of the more notable moments for you over that time?
The scale and the scope of the investigation that we undertook is what stands out. You know, as someone who has been a litigator and lawyer for many years, especially litigating cases around equal protection in the 14th Amendment, you know, our legal standards require you to do studies that are very sound in terms of their methodology, and also speaking to and engaging with thousands of Black Californians who gave us their anecdotal experience and who served as fact witnesses for this process.
This plan includes many different types of reparations, but monetary reparations often gets a lot of attention. Can you talk about the case being made for that kind of reparations?
I tend to not talk about that because that's really the only thing that gets attention. And so, for instance, the final report is going to be about 31 chapters, and maybe one chapter is dedicated to financial conversations, and 30 chapters are dedicated to systems change for every single sector. And so there is this imbalance in the narrative that I feel obligated to push back on, because yes, reparations is about paying a debt in terms of financial compensation that's owed to Black people, and we did have economists grapple with that issue specifically and provide a formula for the legislature to figure out how to do that. But reparations is much bigger than that. Reparations is about repairing systems. It's about creating structures and supports and opportunity so the harm finally ceases and desists and never happens again.
Ms. Holder, thanks so much for joining us.
It's been a pleasure talking to you. I hope to talk to you again in the future.
Lisa Holder is a civil rights attorney, a member of the California Reparations Task Force, and president of the Oakland-based Equal Justice Society. There are dozens of policy changes recommended in the report, and some of them seek to address the legacy of housing segregation and discrimination. For instance, it was once common practice to deny housing to Black people in dozens of neighborhoods in the Bay.
Decades later, Black neighborhoods across the state were targeted by predatory lenders selling bad deals.
In order to repair that harm, the task force is recommending direct financial assistance to increase Black home ownership in the state. But will the proposals help Black homeowners who are struggling to keep their homes?
KQED's Maria Fernanda Bernal dug into that question. She brings us this story about Richmond resident Faye Moret Crosley.
Faye Moret Crosley waited for the sheriff to knock on her door at 6 a.m. on a stormy January morning. She was getting evicted, while surrounded by friends and neighbors. She's an 80-year-old Black woman who lived in the house in an unincorporated Richmond for 30 years. Crosley, who has been walking gingerly since she broke her 5 ribs in a fall 2 years ago, offered guests bagels and juice.
We got juice over here, pomegranate, orange, apple, and Kevin's bringing the glasses.
The Golden Gate Bridge was visible from the living room picture window of the 7-bedroom Highland Avenue home. The walls were adorned with decades of family portraits. The house was the heart of family gatherings and celebrations. Crosley's special needs daughter and her grandson, Kevin Hayes, lived with her.
Now, it was an amazing house because when I came, I liked they had those openings, for the pictures and stuff. Most of my families lived here. Kevin had all the cousins.
Crosley's struggle to save her home began in January 2009 after she defaulted on her first loan for the first time, according to public records. In an effort to stay afloat, she had refinanced 5 times in 6 years through 4 different lenders. The amount she owed on her loan was double the home's value. She was underwater and her mortgage doubled. She told KQED that her mortgage jumped from $1,700 to $3,900 a month. The retired real estate agent said she couldn't afford that on her alimony and the supplemental income she gets from taking care of her daughter. Finally, in the fall of 2012, Crosley's mortgage lender stopped cashing her checks.
They wouldn't accept the payments anymore. And see, my daughter, she knows all about the computers and stuff, so she knew how to send that money in through the computer. We could send it to the post office. We'd send it in different ways, and they blocked it. They wouldn't accept no payments.
Crosley was like many Black homeowners in the early 2000s who were targeted by subprime loans and adjustable rate mortgages. People who refinance their homes with loans that include rising rates and payments are more likely to enter foreclosure. Verlena Green is an attorney who specializes in elder law.
This is really when the mortgage crisis really started to get attention and it started to heat up and consumers were unable to make their mortgage payments, likely because there was an adjustable rate mortgage on the property.
Green reviewed public records obtained by KQED that show there were 30 deed transfers on Crosley's home in 3 decades. Green has never seen a situation where a loan has been reassigned so many times. She said when banks assign loans to other banks, it grows into a web of confusion for consumers.
So by the time this person says, hey, listen, I want to refinance, I need a loan modification because I can't make payments, she probably didn't know who to make payments to.
I reached out to Crosley's last mortgage lending service, but they refused to comment. Black homeowners are actually struggling to keep their homes now more than ever. In 2021, California's Black homeownership rate was almost 30 points lower than white residents, according to census data. To put that gulf into perspective, the Black homeownership rate was higher in the 1960s when it was legal to discriminate against Black home buyers. Don Tamaki is a member of the Reparations Task Force.
Everybody else has been able to sort of move up the ladder, but Black people have not been. And they did gain ground in 2000s, and they lost it during the mortgage crisis.
The Reparations Task Force will submit their report to the Legislature on July 1st. The housing recommendations won't help someone like Crosley, but if passed, would help first-time home buyers and provide restitution for homes that were seized to make room for highways and other public infrastructure projects.
It does cover things like making loans available, providing more affordable housing, dealing with the aftermath of racial zoning and redlining. These proposals that are being submitted is simply the beginning of asking the legislature to do something about the harm that's been caused.
Crosley's grandson, Kevin Hayes, shared her story on Instagram. He raised more than $23,000 on GoFundMe, money that was used to pay for legal fees, storage, and to rent an apartment. There isn't any money left. After Crosley was evicted, supporters rallied in her old neighborhood to call out predatory lending.
This elder abuse has got to go! Hey, hey! Ho, ho! This elder abuse has got to go! Hey, hey! Ho, ho!
But she's not getting the home back. A foreclosure company sold it to a bank almost a year ago. The home she bought for $235,000 in 1992 is now on the market for $1 million. Crosley moved into a small apartment near the Richmond Marina with her daughter. There's space for only a fraction of the pictures and knickknacks that once decorated her home.
Yeah, it's just like our old living room, right?
All our stuff is in little bitty bags like this. It looked like thousands of them in the store.
After months of housing instability, Hayes now lives in a communal space in Oakland. He said Crosley's health has declined since being evicted.
I just want her to be happy, and I think that the only way that would happen is if she just gets to be back in her house. So I think that's what really breaks me too. It just hurts so much to know that pain is there, and that's what she'll have, the last section of her life is themed around that right now.
I'm Maria Fernanda Bernal, KQED News.
If you're just joining us, you're listening to KQED's Reparations Radio Special. I'm Azul Dahlstrom-Ekman.
And I'm Annalise Finney. Later this month, the state task force studying reparations for Black Californians will submit its historic final report to the state legislature.
And on this Juneteenth weekend, we're digging into what this plan includes and what it would take for the plan to become a reality.
I recently sat down with KQED politics correspondent Guy Marzorati to talk about how lawmakers might respond to the proposal. Hey, Guy.
Hey.
So, how has the state legislature responded to the work of the Reparations Task Force so far?
Well, it was the state legislature that created the task force back in 2020. This was in the wake of George Floyd's murder. There was a lot of, fanfare around the creation of this task force, a historic step for racial justice in California, bipartisan vote. People were celebrating that kind of thing. Since then, though, as the task force has gotten to work over the last couple years, held public meetings, this conversation has really been put aside at the state capitol. I talked to Stephen Bradford. He's a state senator who also serves on the task force. I talked to him last summer after the task force put out their interim report, and here's kind of how he described the reception in the state capitol.
I'm sad to report not a single one of my colleagues have even mentioned this report, and I doubt very seriously if any of them have really taken time to read it.
So from conversations I've had with lawmakers since then, it seems like not much has changed. Despite the task force holding hearings up and down the state, really laying out the history of the legislature's own culpability in harms against Black Californians, historically, you haven't really heard that conversation translate to a lot of action in the Assembly and Senate yet.
Okay, so tell us about the legislature's history when it comes to slavery in California.
Right. So as most school kids know, California came into the Union in 1850 as a free state, but really supporters of slavery had a huge influence in early politics in California. I talked to Oregon State professor Stacy Smith, who studied this, and she talks about how there's a lot of elected officials who literally came here from the South and really sought to shape California state policy in support of slavery.
We do know that Northerners complained bitterly all the time, especially Northerners who were opposed to slavery, bitterly, that essentially pro-slavery white Southerners had taken over the state government.
And one example of that is the California Fugitive Slave Act. So that let slave owners track down Black residents who had been brought to California as slaves before California officially became a free state. That bill was actually carried in the state Senate by a senator from the North Bay who owned slaves on a farm in Solano County. So there were slave owners in the actual legislature putting forth this legislation. You can also look at the Kansas-Nebraska Act, 1854. This was a federal law that allowed slavery to expand in the territories. Extremely controversial. It led us on the path to the Civil War. And California, a free state, our legislature passed a resolution supporting the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which is really just unheard of at the time for a free state legislature. So that's a little bit about the legislature's own direct involvement in expanding slavery and pushing for the expansion of slavery, although we know kind of the justification more broadly for the task force work goes beyond slavery. They're talking about decades of harm to Black Californians, in the 20th century and beyond as they kind of lay out this work.
Okay, so now we're about 2 weeks away from when the task force is going to submit its final report and recommendations to the legislature. What can we expect to see when some of those proposals are actually voted on in the state capitol?
Yeah, so this report is going to come out at a kind of strange time in the legislative calendar, right? It's too late to really introduce new bills for the most part. The state budget process is going to be basically wrapped up. So what I've heard from lawmakers who, like Reggie Jones-Sawyer, like Stephen Bradford, who are also in the legislature and on the task force, is that it's more likely next legislative year that begins in January, you'll see more of these proposals introduced as legislation.
Okay, and I understand there are some bills that are being considered now that correspond to some of the ideas the task force is putting forward. where are those in the legislative process and how have they fared?
Yeah, I've kind of called this an early test for the legislature on reparations because these are ideas that, while they may not directly come from the task force, submitting their final report, they match up directly with ideas that the task force has supported. I think there's going to be a lot of focus on the cash side of this, right? The task force has identified harms and damages like, over $13,000 for each year lived in the state for health disparities, over $2,000 for living in California during the era of mass incarceration. But these ideas that I'm talking about that have already been introduced this year are not really about cash, right? One of them, ACA 4, would ask voters to restore voting rights for Californians serving time in state prison. There's another constitutional amendment, ACA 8, that would put a measure on the state ballot to delete involuntary servitude from the state constitution. That's really aimed at work requirements for people in state prison. So those bills are still awaiting a vote in the state assembly. That could happen this summer. There's already been some other bills reflecting ideas from the task force that have been rejected in the state legislature. Most notably, there's a bill voted down earlier this month that would have prohibited law enforcement from doing consent searches. So this is basically asking to search a person or their car without having a warrant. There was opposition to that from law enforcement groups that really convinced not only Republicans, but a lot of Democrats to vote against that and ultimately reject that on the floor of the state assembly.
What will you be watching for at the Capitol when this final report finally arrives there?
Yeah, I think when this report, is finally sent to the legislature, it really ends this time period where lawmakers have really been able to dodge sharing their opinion on the reparations process, right? For the last couple of years, it's been, well, look, we had a vote to create the task force. Let's see what they come up with. Let's see, what they do. Let's let them do their work. Well, now the work is about to be done. They're about to be sending this report to the legislature. And so it's time to really get answers from lawmakers on where do they stand on these proposals. Again, the cash payment thing is going to get a lot of attention. California's budget shortfall right now is over $30 billion. I think that's going to be an out a lot of lawmakers use to say, look, we just can't afford to do something like that at this time. But, there's dozens of proposals the task force has put forward that aren't related to cash payments. They're the kind of ideas that don't require, the state to be spending billions of dollars. And you heard Governor Gavin Newsom say, well, reparations are about more than cash. Okay, well, there's going to be dozens of proposals that don't have to do with direct payments on everything from policing to education to healthcare policy, and we'll see what kind of reception those ideas get in the legislature.
Guy, thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure.
Guy Marzorati is a politics correspondent for KQED.
Well, Annalise, that's all for now.
But just for now, we'll be back with more of our Reparations Radio special throughout the day.
The Reparations Task Force is presenting its final recommendations on June 29th in Sacramento. That event will be open to the public. I'm Azul Dahlstrom-Ekman.
And I'm Annalise Finney. This is KQED News on the Weekend.
It's Weekend Edition on KQED. I'm Azul Dahlstrom-Ekman.
And I'm Annalise Finney. You're listening to KQED's Reparations Radio Special.
Later this month, the statewide task force studying reparations for Black Californians will submit its historic final report to the state legislature.
Throughout the day, we're bringing you stories and interviews that explain the case being made for reparations in California.
2 years ago, when the task force set out to design a plan for reparations, their research revealed some pretty stark statistics. Numbers that showed the impact of state-sanctioned discrimination against Black residents.
For instance, the average life expectancy for Black Americans is about 7 years less than for white Americans. And even though studies show that people of all races use and sell illegal drugs at roughly the same rates, Black Californians are more likely to be arrested for drug-related activities and sentenced for longer than white people.
Education is another area where government disinvestment has harmed Black communities. I sat down with Margaret Fortune to talk about how California's reparations proposals might change education in the state. Fortune served as an education advisor to 2 California governors and is the president and CEO of a public charter network in California. She gave expert testimony to the Reparations Task Force back in March. Ms. Fortune, thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much. I'm glad to be on.
What's the state of the achievement gap for African American students in California schools now?
So 70% of African American students in the state of California's public schools do not read or write at grade level, and 84% are not achieving at grade level in mathematics. So this is what is driving efforts for reform and also specific focus on the state's lowest performing subgroup of students not already receiving special grants and recognition as a high needs group, and that's African American students.
So how has state action or inaction affected these education outcomes?
I think the greatest harm has been ignoring African American students. It's been to talk about them in the rhetoric, but never address the issue in the policy. And the governor's equity multiplier is an example of that. $300 million that is talked about as supposedly benefiting Black students, but then you find out only 5% of the money, 5 to 7% of the money will actually go to Black students. That's the harm. And we have found a willingness to be very specific in addressing the needs of other high need students, deservedly, in a way that the state will not do for Black students. And now Black students can be distinguished not by their race, but by their academic performance, their low academic performance. So that's the harm that needs to be repaired through investment and through accountability.
What are your thoughts on the recommendations on education in this report?
Well, one of the recommendations that the report has made is that a way to provide additional funding is through the local control funding formula. And just to break that down, that's the public school funding formula. It's how California funds schools. And every school gets a base amount, and then you get more grants if you're serving high need students. So the legislation that we propose that the Reparations Task Force acknowledges and calls out as a potential remedy would have included the lowest performing subgroup in the state, driving additional dollars to the schools that serve them. And now that's worth about $6,000 per student. And it's a race neutral policy. You know, it doesn't drive the money to these schools that are serving these students because of the kids' race. It's because of their academic performance. Now, there are some that really refuse to do anything in particular for Black students, and that's really, where the rub is. Because California has become the Don't Say Black state, you have Black students really suffering and dying on the vine in schools that don't particularly focus on them. But I think it's high time that we focus in particular on the lowest performing group. It's not because of their race, it's because of their academic performance. And then when another group has that dubious distinction, the focus will be on them.
Margaret Fortune, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Margaret Fortune is the president and CEO of 12 public charter schools in California and served as an education advisor to 2 California governors.
Another area of harm the State Reparations Task Force focused on is environmental discrimination.
In other words, allowing for, and in some cases pushing, highways or toxic industries into Black communities.
KQED climate reporter Ezra David Romero says it's not an accident people of color are some of the most vulnerable to sea level rise. He brings us this story from West Oakland, where some residents believe climate justice is a form of reparations.
Thousands of people live in West Oakland, a bridge away from San Francisco, boxed in by freeways, a port, and numerous industries. Margaret Gordon shows me around the northern edge of the neighborhood.
So where are we going to go? Okay, we're going to go over the overpass.
We pass charcoal gray and white condominiums about a half mile from San Francisco Bay. As seas continue to rise, Gordon, who founded the West Oakland Environmental Indicators Project, foresees a looming disaster.
These will be the first victims of a sea level rise.
And not only from surface flooding. Between these homes and the bay are hazardous sites, like an old army base contaminated with petroleum and other chemicals. That contamination can move around as water under the ground rises.
Those toxic soils will be a hindrance to the community.
There are going to be surprises, and they're going to be real health risks.
Christina Hill directs the Institute for Urban and Regional Development at UC Berkeley. Rising seas move inland on top of the land and underneath it.
The seawater actually comes under the land, almost like it's sticking its toe under the fresh water.
That seawater pushes the fresh water up, where it can mix with contamination. As the pollution loosens, it can release poisonous gases in and around sewer and water pipes.
The gas can enter buildings, workplaces, schools, and homes through cracks in the concrete slab foundation.
Across West Oakland, there are more than 130 active toxic sites. West Oakland grew up as an industrial powerhouse some 150 years ago when the Transcontinental Railroad ended its long journey here. Over time, shipbuilding, metal foundries, auto yards, and dry cleaners filled this corner of Oakland. Racist home lending policies like redlining relegated Black people to this neighborhood.
It is a lesson in discrimination and disregard and diminishment of a population that is helping build a city.
Dorothy Lazard grew up in West Oakland. She retired 2 years ago as the managing librarian of the Oakland History Center. Lazard said the policy of eminent domain decimated Black neighborhoods and business districts, allowing governments to seize land and destroy homes to build freeways and a commuter train line.
Claiming eminent domain is, to me, kind of commensurate to colonialism. You know, it's kind of like we can use this as our dumping ground because we've already devalued this space.
Lazard says racist policies exposed residents to life-threatening environmental pollution without their consent.
Those impulses are still there.
Margaret Gordon sits on a park bench in front of her apartment as semi-trucks crawl the street and a commuter train zips by. She tells me climate justice must mean reparations.
To me, the reparation movement is the next level of civil rights.
For Gordon, reparations mean more than payment to the descendants of slaves. They mean actions that restore consent to the community, like cleaning up toxic sites, economic opportunities, and power in planning decisions about climate resilience.
We will have long-standing sustainability. I would know that there's going to be housing for my children, grandchildren. There's going to be a job for them.
Climate change and reparations in terms of a response to the history of racial injustice have the same roots.
Olufemi Taiwo is an associate professor at Georgetown University. He's the author of the book Reconsidering Reparations, with a chapter on climate reparations.
Even if you didn't buy the historical story about why reparations and climate crisis are linked, there is a straightforward practical story of if you want to actually change who faces what level of death, disease, and displacement, this is something that you should pay attention to.
He says climate justice and reparations are the same project. In West Oakland, I'm Ezra David Romero, KQED News.
If you're just joining us, you're listening to KQED's Reparations Radio Special. I'm Azul Dahlstrom-Ekman.
And I'm Annalise Finney. Later this month, the state task force studying reparations for Black Californians will submit its historic final report to the state legislature.
And on this Juneteenth weekend, we're digging into what this plan includes and what it would take for the plan to become a reality.
I recently sat down with Sacramento State professor of political science Mark Brown. He studies race and political theory and has been following the work of the task force. Professor Brown, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for inviting me.
So, in a recent op-ed in the Sacramento Bee, you wrote that paying reparations to the descendants of American slavery is a question of political responsibility. Can you explain what you mean by that?
Yes, it means a few different things. First of all, it's a way of saying that reparations is not about individual guilt. You can only be guilty for things you have done yourself, and nobody alive today is personally guilty of enslaving anyone. So talking about reparations as a matter of political responsibility is a way of saying that it's a shared collective responsibility, and it's a way of talking about taking responsibility for the wrongs committed by the government that represents us.
So the recommendations that the state task force has made don't specify how they would be paid for, but presumably it will include some amount of taxpayer dollars, including the taxes paid by Black residents of California. How does that fit into your understanding of political responsibility and the state's role here?
I do think funding it through taxpayer dollars is the most democratic. And that does mean that potentially recipients would also pay into the fund that pays for reparations. But that should really be seen as a form of inclusion and of citizenship. And we have a progressive tax system, and those who are more wealthy pay more taxes. And so I think that could be a way to increase public support for reparations, to make clear it's not about white people being asked to give something to Black people. It's about all of us as democratic citizens trying to take account of the wrongs committed by our government.
So if the state does create reparations programs, how do you think that might impact political divisions in California and across the country?
Yeah, people often say that reparations is going to be divisive. It certainly is a controversial topic, and there are huge differences among different groups in public opinion. But our country is already strongly divided on a whole range of issues, and public opinion on questions of racial disparity and racial justice is one of the most significant areas of division. And I think there's actually a good case to be made that reparations can help to reduce division and to provide a certain kind of reconciliation. That's often been the role of reparations in other countries as part of a peace process. Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee was recently quoted as saying that, quote, reparations are ultimately about respect, reconciliation, and healing. And I think there's at least the potential that it could play that role in helping to overcome some of our political divisions.
Professor Brown, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much.
Mark Brown is a professor of political science at California State University in Sacramento.
Well, Annalise, that's all for now.
We'll be back with more of our Reparations radio special throughout the day. You can find all of KQED's reparations coverage online at kqed.org/reparations. I'm Annalise Finney.
And I'm Azul Dahlstrom-Ekman, and you're listening to KQED News on the Weekend.